Hi, welcome back to Educator.com's AP Music Theory course. Today's lesson is on scales. So for this lesson, we are going to first make sure that we understand scale steps. So we're going to look at whole and half steps. And then we're going to learn the major and minor scale patterns, which consist of different patterns of the whole and half steps that we learned. And finally, we're going to learn to transpose these major and minor scale patterns to any starting pitch. Okay, so whole steps and half steps. We can use this piano keyboard graphic again to help us understand the difference between a whole step and a half step, and then we'll see where they fall on the staff. So let's see, we can again find our note C, which is of course the white note directly to the left of the grouping of two black notes. And so let's just count it from there. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So we've got this range of C to C here. And so looking at the keyboard, we see that between C and D, there's one black note. And between D and E, there's a black note. And then between E and F, there is no note. So these steps here, where there's a note in between, we say are whole steps, and I'll indicate them with these brackets. And then from E to F, where there is no note in between, this is a half step. So this is a whole step, half step. And so if we were going to go on to look at the rest, we'll see that between F and G is a whole step, G and A is a whole step, A and B is a whole step, and here's another half step between B and C. And of course, if we were using the black notes, we would say that, between this black note here and this white note is a half step, and between this same black note and the white note below it is a half step. So half step is basically when there's no note in between, and a whole step is when we've got one note in between. So let's look at this same C to C range on the staff. So remembering that middle C on the treble clef is here, we'll go C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And so we know that, and I'll label these. So we know that the half step in the staff is between E and F. So I'll label that, and B and C. So here. And the rest of these are whole steps. So it's very important to remember where these are on the staff. You just have to memorize it, or you can picture the piano keyboard in your head, but knowing that all these steps are not equal, even though they look like they're just going up by the same step, is very important and a fundamental thing to know about the staff. Okay, so now that we are familiar with whole and half steps, we can use them to build a major scale. So it just so happens that this range of white notes on the keyboard from C to C is a major scale. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So this is the pattern of a major scale. So we can write this down again on the treble clef. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And so let's look at, again, the pattern of whole and half steps, because that's what determines this scale to sound the way it does. So here is a whole step, here's a whole step, here is a half step between E and F, and here's a whole step, a whole step, a whole step, and then a half step between B and C. So here are the half steps. So it turns out that the major scale consists of the pattern whole, whole, half, and then whole, 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 half. So later we'll use this sequence of whole and half steps to make a major scale starting on any note, and the piano keyboard will help us to count the whole and half steps. Okay, and looking at minor scales, so it turns out that there's three common forms of the minor scale that we'll look at the pattern of whole and half steps for. And the first one of those is natural minor. So natural minor, looking at white notes, starts on this note here, which let's start with our C here. So we know this is a C, and natural minor starts on this note here, so we can count down C, B, A. So it goes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. And let's write that in the staff. So here is C, and counting up D, E, F, G, A. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A. And now let's examine the keyboard again and find where the half steps are. So here's two notes without anything in the middle, so that's a half step. And here's the other one, again, between E and F. And the rest all have a black note in between, so these are the two half steps. So between B and C and E and F. And so it turns out that the natural minor pattern of whole and half steps is whole, half, whole, whole, half, whole, and whole. And again, we can use this pattern to build a natural minor scale starting on any note, as long as we stick to this arrangement of whole and half steps. Okay, next let's look at harmonic minor. So now we're going to be using a black note on the keyboard. So we'll start with our same natural minor scale. And now the difference is that instead of using this G as a white note, we're going to move it up to the next black note, which means that it is a G sharp now, since it's being raised by one half step. So what does that do to the arrangement of whole and half steps? Let's see. So now we've still got this one here between B and C, and we still have the one between E and F. And now we have an additional one, since we've moved the G up a half step, means that there's now no note between G sharp and A. So here is our third half step. And let's write this on the staff. So here's A, F, G sharp, and A. So again, we already know that the naturally occurring half steps in the staff are between B and C and E and F. And now we've created another one by raising this note. So here's this one. And let's write out the pattern for the harmonic minor scale. So it's whole, half, whole, whole, half, and then this step here, which is now one step bigger than a whole step, so we'll just make it a plus sign, and then ending with a half step. And finally, let's look at a melodic minor scale. And the difference between the melodic minor scale and the other minor scales, and even the major scale that we've seen so far, is that it has two different forms, one for when you're going up the scale and one for when you're coming back down. So it turns out the form going down the melodic minor scale is the same as natural minor. So we can write that over here, since we've already covered it. So it's just A, G, F, E, D, C, B, A. So same as natural minor. But let's look at the ascending form. So we're going to start on this A again. B, C, D, E. And then instead of going this half step from E to F, we're going to go a whole step to F sharp, and then another whole step to G sharp, and then we're back to A. So let's write that on the staff. A, B, C, D, F sharp, G sharp, and here's the A. Okay, and what we're interested in is the pattern of whole and half steps, so let's use the piano keyboard to find them. So here is a whole step, here is a half step, here's whole, whole, and then another whole, and then here's a half step. So if we're talking about melodic minor ascending, the pattern of whole and half steps is whole, half, whole, 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 half. And let's find these on the staff. So here's the half step between B and C, and then here's the half step between G sharp and A. And let's do melodic minor descending as well. So descending is going to be the same as natural minor. So we've got, and we'll count it downwards. So we'll go whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. And so remember that this is, we're going counting downwards from the top of the scale. Okay, for our first example problem, now let's use some of our whole and half step knowledge to make scales on other notes. So let's say we're asked to create a D major scale. So first we want to find the note D. Here it is. And we know that the scale is going to have one of each note from D to D. So first thing we can do is write out all the notes on the right line of the staff, and then worry about any accidentals we need to add later. So here's D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. And so let's look at the pattern of whole and half steps that we need again. So let's use the C major scale to help us. So we know we've got from C to D is a whole step, so this needs to be whole step, and then D to E is a whole step, so this needs to be a whole step, and then E to F is a half step, so here is where our half step should be, and then F to G, whole step, whole step, whole step, and finally half step for the last step of the major scale. So again, I'm using our established pattern of the whole and half steps in C major, and I'm going to transpose it to this D major scale. So now I just have to make sure that this conforms. So let's see, from D to E, is that a whole step? Well, you can either remember where the whole half steps are in treble clef, or you can check on the piano keyboard. So yes, D to E is a whole step. And E to F, is that a whole step? Let's see. So no. So what does that mean? It means we need to change the F to a note that will make this a whole step, which means we need to go up here to this black note. So this ends up being an F sharp. So now we're on an F sharp. Going to G, is that a half step? Yes, it is. And then G to A, that's a whole step. A to B, is that a whole step? Yes. and then B to C needs to be a whole step, which it's a half step. So again, we're going to need to raise this C up to this black note here to make sure we've got a whole step. So this is a C sharp. And then from C sharp to D, is that a half step? Yes. So it turns out that we added 2 sharps to this sequence of notes from D to D to make it a major scale. So here are the half steps, and they conform to the same major scale half step and whole step arrangement, which is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Okay, for our second example, let's do an example of a natural minor scale. So let's say we are asked to write natural minor scale starting from this note. So this is a G. So we need to know, first of all, of course, we can fill in, oops, that looks like a G. So we can fill in the notes. So here's A, B, C, D, E, F, back to G. And now we need to think about what pattern of whole and half steps do we need for a natural minor scale. So remember that on the piano keyboard, the white notes from A to A make natural minor. So let's see, we've got to start with a whole step from A to B, and so let's write out this pattern. So whole step, and then from B to C is a half step, and then from C to D is a whole step, D to E, whole step, E to F, half step, F to G, whole step, and G to A, whole step. So now let's make sure that we've got this pattern down here. So from G to A, we see is a whole step, so that's good. And then from A to B, we need to be a half step. So it's a whole step, so that means we need to bring this B down, which means flatting it. So now we've got A to B flat, which is a half step, so that's good. And now we need a whole step between B flat and C, which it is a whole step because this note is in the middle, of course. So that's good. And now we need a whole step between the next 2 notes, C and D, which there is a note in between, so there's a whole step. And now we need, for natural minor, a half step between the next 2 notes, which so far is written D and E. So we need to, again, take this E down a half step to E flat. So there's our half step. And I'll mark the half step now. And then from E flat to F needs to be a whole step, so that's fine. And from F to G needs to be a whole step, so that's fine. So here's our half steps for our natural minor scale. And again, they conform in that they're between the 2nd and the 3rd and the 5th and the 6th notes of the scale. Okay, for example 3, let's say we are asked to write a harmonic minor scale, starting on the note, let's say D. So the first things first, we can write out all of our notes. And then we need to remember how to find the harmonic scale on the piano. So if we're starting with our natural minor scale, we just remember that the second or the last note of the scale is raised a half step. So it's from A to A with a G sharp instead of a G. So now let's look at where the half steps are. So here's a half step between B and C, and then here's a half step between E and F, and here's a half step between G sharp and A. So let's make sure that we have the right arrangement. So D to E, whole step, matches with this whole step. E to F, which is a half step, and it matches with this half step of B to C. And then C to D is a whole step, which means we need a whole step between F and G, so that's fine. And then let's see, from D to E is a whole step, and so is G to A, so that's fine. And then E to F is a half step, but A to B is a whole step, so now we need to alter something. So we've got to bring this B down to this black note, which means it's a B flat. And now we've got a whole step, or a half step between the last two notes, G sharp and A, but from C to D is a whole step, as we see here. So we're going to need to take this C up to a C sharp. So let's mark the half steps. So it's between the second and third, the fifth and sixth, and the seventh and eighth, and that corresponds exactly to what we've got here. So here's our harmonic minor, or D harmonic minor, rather. Okay, and for the last example, let's do an example of an ascending melodic minor scale. And let's say we're asked to write this on, starting on a C. Okay, so going back to our piano keyboard, let's find the melodic minor scale that we used earlier. So we know that from A to A is natural minor, and for a melodic minor, we need to raise the last two notes of the scale. So these can all stay white keys. And now here, these last two notes, the F and the G, become F sharp and G sharp, which means that there's the half step here, and now there's no half step until we get to the G sharp and A. So let's make sure we have this same pattern for the C scale that we've written here. So we've got a whole step between A and B, and C and D is a whole step, so that's fine. And then we need to make a half step between B and C, or we have a half step between B and C, we need to make one between D and E. So this becomes an E flat. So here's the first half step, and then C and D is a whole step, and let's see, E flat and F is a whole step, so that's fine. And then D and E is a whole step, and so is F and G, so that's fine. And then E and F sharp is a whole step, and so is G and A, so that's fine. And then F to G sharp, whole step. A to B is also a whole step, so nothing to change here. And then finally, we've got a half step between G sharp and A, and these last two notes, B and C, are a half step, so everything's fine here, and we didn't need to add any accidentals. So here's our ascending melodic minor on C. So C ascending melodic minor. Okay, thanks for watching Educator.com's AP Music Theory course. See you next time.